Hey everybody, welcome back to Video. So today we're continuing the series on the MiSTer FPGA DE10 Nano project, and we're going to be doing another one of the Would It Work on MiSTer FPGA videos today, because you guys seem to really enjoy these, and it gives me a better chance to talk about more arcade hardware, and you know if you watch the channel, I love that. And today we're going to be talking about the Taito F3, one of Taito's best arcade boards that is absolutely miserable to actually deal with in real life if you collect for it. Before I get too far involved, do me a huge favor, go down below, hit like and subscribe, and ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out. And if you feel so inclined to want to support the channel, we got a Patreon link down below as well. But the Taito F3 is absolutely filled with some of the best Taito arcade games of all time in my opinion, and I'll go over later in the video why it's actually very frustrating to own the hardware. But let's go over the specs of the F3 first, because a lot of them are already incorporated in MiSTer FPGA in some shape or form, and that definitely gives us a head start. Now over on the main CPU, you're going to see a Motorola 68020 running at 16 MHz. And if that sounds familiar, obviously the 68000 is a very popular CPU. But on the 68020 side, if we go over to the Mini-Mig Amiga core, you're going to see that it supports different CPUs, including the 68020. And that means at least in its current iteration, 68020 code in FPGA would be working on MiSTer. Now of course there might be some slight variables in this, but we know the MiSTer can handle that because we have the Amiga core, and it's definitely an awesome core. If you haven't checked it out yet, I definitely recommend it. But this is something that's already been done on MiSTer, already proven to work, so you know a 68020 would function. I think maybe the Motorola 68040 might be a little bit too high test for MiSTer FPGA and the DE10 chip itself, but I think for the most part, obviously we know the 68020 is something that will work on MiSTer, so you can basically eliminate that. And that's the great part about MiSTer FPGA and the FPGA code and modules within the system in and of itself. Something like the 68020 is already here, so you can definitely basically check that one off the list. Now on the sound CPU side of things, you're going to see the classic Motorola 68000 running at 16 MHz, and obviously we know that's something that can work on MiSTer FPGA as well. It's in the Sega Genesis core, but of course you know me, I'm going to be showing some Neo Geo, because the Neo Geo central CPU for the actual code execution is a 68000 chip. This was one of the most popular CPUs to use for video games, both on the home console and arcade side of things. And we've been playing Neo Geo, Sega Genesis, and many other 68000 based arcade boards for a very long time on MiSTer FPGA. So something like Riding Fight Taito F3 here, when it's executing the game code, you could pull that off on MiSTer FPGA, no issues whatsoever, because we're already doing it. But of course there's also sound chips as well. We have the Sonic ES5505 running at 16 MHz. Now these two chips, as far as I can tell, have not yet been incorporated on MiSTer FPGA, but a lot is known about them. You're going to see these two different sound chips right here listed. And if we pop over to Wikipedia, you're going to see it's called the 5506 Auto, so I'm not sure if System 16 hit the wrong key there. I've always known it as the Auto chip. This is what's on a Taito F3 board. I have owned them, and it was on a ton of different sound cards for PC back in the day as well. It's a very popular sound chip. It got used a lot both on the arcade side of things as well as the PC market, and I think the Taito F3 has absolutely spectacular audio quality coming out of the board. So I'm going to let you listen to the soundtrack of Darius Gaiden just for like 25 seconds so you can hear what it sounds like, but come right back because I got a lot more specs to show you. Not only is the sound quality of the Auto absolutely outstanding, of course you get the Zuntata music on most Taito arcade games, and that is just outstanding. You're going to see we also have a DSP or digital signal processor, the ES5510, and that is going to be basically a derivative of the Auto as a DSP, not a sound chip in and of itself. And interestingly, this is very similar to the Atari Panther dev card that I have in my collection for the sound side of things. This is actually going to use the Otis chip, but Sonic had a very big hold on gaming, both on the home console space in part with this Panther dev unit, as well as the arcade side of things. They definitely made a push into gaming in the early 90s, and they were around for a bit before it basically all folded. And we do know a lot about this chip. This is MAME driver code right here. It has been working for the longest time. Now obviously we're not bringing MAME code onto an FPGA. It does need to be reverse engineered, but the good thing is understanding how things are supposed to work would aid a developer in actually standing them up on something like FPGA code. This is useful just as a learning tool because someone's already gone through and tried to understand the function of that actual chip. Now on the hardware side of things, as far as how it's displaying, the Taito F3 has a lot of different interesting graphical features, and those would all have to be dealt with in the silicon to reverse engineer them into FPGA code. So this is definitely going to be a very long process if somebody tries to take it on, because it's not the simplest hardware. There were so many interesting graphical effects the F3 could do, even though it was 2D, that while there being a plane looks like it's 3D, and it really does look like you're in a 3D screen space, it does have a really nice look to it. And again, as we bust through this wall here, just watch how that wall actually looks. It has the appearance of actually being in a 3D space when it is just 2D, sprite scaling and other rotation and transform effects. Or something like Lightbringer here doesn't do that, but it's got a ton of sprites on screen at once. There's a lot of different effects, so I do think reverse engineering these particular chips on an F3 board to get the actual video out would definitely be a difficult task. I'm not saying it's not possible. It does seem like it should work on the MiSTer FPGA, but again, you have to remember, we're not just talking about will it work from a technical standpoint. The other question is, how long is it going to take a person or a team of people to actually get this functioning? And you'll see here in Riding Fight, there's a ton of ability to make this look like 3D. It was a big sprite scaling board, and honestly, I think Taito and their artists and developers did as good a job at sprite scaling as Sega ever did. But leave me a comment down below and tell me what you think. And you'll see here as we actually get into the foreground, we're going to go horizontal versus vertical in the scaling, and there's so many effects here. But let's talk about the big elephant in the room. That is actually getting the Taito F3 to sync to anything. Obviously, this is just MiSTer on a PVM. There's not an F3 board here. But the sync rate on the Taito F3 is absolutely a disaster. I have owned these boards. I own 4 PVMs and multiple different monitors, and I was only ever to get one monitor to actually sync to this thing, and that's after I went into the service menu and adjusted so many things, it broke the ability to sync any other arcade board I owned except the Taito F3. It does a very strange thing with the sync rate and the frame rate, and trying to get this thing to sync on a CRT television that is not an arcade monitor is an absolute mess. And if you go to the scaler side of things, it is not much better, and somebody actually reversed engineered some of the timings of the actual sync rate, and it is just a messy board to deal with. My FrameMeister would not deal with it. OSSC has trouble. The only thing I've ever seen sync to the F3 consistently is going to be the RetroTink 4K, which is awesome. It's a great scaler and it syncs to pretty much everything, but not everyone's going to want to do something like that. So if the Taito F3 was on MiSTer FPGA, you'd be able to actually get rock solid sync and a rock solid image out of the analog I/O board, or if you went over HDMI, you would get the same thing. Yeah, it would have to pivot the frame rate ever so slightly, but this would be a hell of a lot easier than trying to actually deal with original Taito F3 hardware. It really is the type of board you want something like the RetroTink 4K for, where you actually want an arcade cabinet with an arcade monitor. But you'll see here as we go underwater, that scaling just looks so good. And if we move over to something like Bubble Symphony, it is just such a pretty game. And the reality is you should want Taito F3 on MiSTer FPGA because it has an absolutely incredible library, some of the most fun Taito games ever made. It's got Puzzle Bobble 2, 3, and 4, and if you've never played these before, let me make you very well aware. You think you're going to play for 10 minutes, and suddenly 2 hours has gone by, and you've absolutely lost complete track of time. The F3 was a very popular board for Taito. It sold well, and they made a ton of games for it, and pretty much every single game they put on this board is fun. In my opinion, the best game, though, is definitely going to be Elevator Action Returns. Sure, you can play this on the Sega Saturn core, or you can just play it on a Saturn, but getting an F3 core to play this would be absolutely spectacular, and that is why I would love to see the Taito F3 come over to MiSTer FPGA. You get one core done, it runs like 36 or so games, you have an absolute great time of doing it, and that's kind of the reality of the F3. The original arcade board does have a multi-cart, so you can play every single game, but again, you need specialized televisions, monitors, or equipment to really try to get a sync signal out of the back of that thing that your television would understand, because this PVM right here would never ever sync to a Taito F3 no matter what I did in the service menu. But do I think the F3 would work on MiSTer FPGA? I do, and I bet someone's going to try to develop it because one core would bring a ton of games to the platform. If you have any recommendations of other arcade boards to look at and whether or not they'd run on MiSTer, leave me a comment down below. But we're done. Go play some Puzzle Bobble, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.